Hey guys, welcome to the session on Coffee with Prabh. And today we are in a second part of the CCSP series where we're going to discuss about Domain 2, Cloud Data Security. And we have our expert with us, Mr. Krish, who currently taking the CCSP batches and also doing the cloud consulting for InfoSec Train and Aspirant Technology. Hi, Krish.
Hey Prabh, hi. Hi everyone.
So I'm sure, Krish, we are here to understand about the Domain 2, the way we did the Domain 1 series.
Exactly,
Let's do with the
exactly.
Domain 2 to understand about how things works and what is important from the exam context and how we should prepare for the Domain 2 of cloud data security. So
Yes.
as I can see, cloud data security currently covered 20% of the exam. Okay, and
Previously it was 20 percentage. Previously it was
how
19 percentage.
yeah,
19.
so
19.
yeah, so based on the new syllabus, I think now they made it as a 20%. And I believe
Yes.
20 the cloud data security is a very important domain of CCSP after domain
Yes.
1, 3 and all that. Because by end of the day, every customer is always look for the concern how to manage data in the cloud. And I'm expecting, when they're building a course, content and exam outline and all that, I'm sure they're given more attention to domain 2, cloud data security.
Exactly.
So when you're talking about this domain, the first module of this domain talk about cloud data concept.
Yes.
Okay, so in this they talk about data lifecycle, data dispersion, data flow. So do you want to share your insight on this area?
So this is one of the most important modules which we have to study when talking about the cloud data security, especially like in the previous domain, we already discussed about the cloud data lifecycle phases,
Mm,
where we have to remember about the CSUSAD concept. And in fact, that's one of the most important concepts which is testable in the exam because
mm,
that, that is a massive concept for sure. That is a massive concept for sure, which
mm,
we have to always understand. Just a second, Prep. Just a minute. Yeah, sorry for that. So now what basically happens is that when you go for something called as a data dispersion, it's actually one of the most important concepts because when you go to a cloud computing, the biggest concern which we have is that the replication of data and the how the data is getting, how it is having a proper redundancy there. Because when you go to on-premises, when you store some data in the on-premises data centers, you will use a concept called as a redundancy there. But at the
mm,
same time, or you have a great concept and all this kind of stuff there, but if you go to the cloud platform, the biggest challenge we are having is that when you go to a cloud computing platform, how the cloud service provider is, safely handling our data. Are they basically making a proper replica of our data and all this kind of stuff? So that data dispersion is talking about how the RAID concept can be used in the cloud platform, or basically how this RAID concept is being used by the cloud service provider when you go to a cloud computing platform. So that is a very important topic which we have to keep in mind. And as a part of learning data dispersion, you have to clearly learn the concept called as a bit splitting and erasure coding, because that is 12 highly testable in the exam, because that is the same concept which is coming as a part of the
but
data
but but
dispersion.
before that, there is a topic as I can see in the slide, which is basically talk about the data life cycle. Okay,
Okay. Hmm.
so in data life cycle, we talk about the phases called um create, store,
Yes.
use, share, archive, and destroy.
Yes.
So it is important for the aspirant who preparing for the CCSP. This area is very important. You must know about what activity happen in each phase. Example, when you talk on create phase is basically where the data is created and we classify the data. In
Yes.
store phase, we talk about data at rest. We talk about the different type of controls we have in the data at rest, like ACL, encryptions, and all that. Data is most vulnerable in the use stage, so we use in DRM, IRM, and masking. Then we store the data. Sorry,
Store,
store,
use,
use, share.
share. Yeah.
Share is basically called as a data in transit, where we prefer DLP also, and we use
Yes.
encryption data in transit.
Yes.
According to the archive policy, we archive the data. Okay, and then we have a destruction. Why we need to have a destruction? Because to limit the liability,
Yes.
and you need to know how to destroy it in the cloud, which is called as a data crypto shredding technique, where we
Ex-
directly delete the encrypted states of data or crypto thing. So the CSUSAD, it's very important. You need to understand the context of security and their cons and pros.
for
Now,
sure.
coming back to the data dispersion, which Krish has said, definitely data dispersion is very important because it is a process of replicating data throughout the distributed storage infrastructure, which is can be span across the region, cities, and all that. So not only the advantage point of view, but also disadvantage of the data dispersion, like
Yes.
regulatory concerns and all that. You need to know that because when we're replicating a data through multiple locations, the reason is very simple: is we don't want the data to be in a single point of access, or we don't want this to be, on the one particular location. So because of the safety against the regulatories and all that, we disperse the data across the multiple locations, and by which we can able to retrieve the data. So do you want to share more information on data dispersion sites, which aspirants need to know from preparation point of view?
So basically, when you go to a cloud computing platform, there is a multiple words which we have called as a resiliency and redundancy also. So we have a concept
Mm,
called as a regions, availability zones, and data centers. So that is something which is very important. A person has to know when they're talking about the data dispersion in the cloud computing. Also, one more thing which we have to keep in mind is that, like, when you go to a cloud computing, there are different kind of storages we are having, and each kind of the storages are having a different kind of data dispersion mechanism. Like, for example, let's say if you go to a storage where some storages will only replicate data inside the same data center, when you go to some other kind of scenarios, they will replicate data across multiple availability zones, and in some cases in multiple regions and all. Again, that, like you said, Prab, like it can contain advantages as well as drawbacks also, because advantage is that it can help us to make sure there is a proper resiliency and proper redundancy there, and the drawback is basically about the location of data, the access to the data, the security controls, and all this kind of stuff can be a very big challenge for sure. And especially, as I said before, when talking about data dispersion, the concept called as a RAID is most important, and also the concept which is called as a LUN mapping, and all these kind of concepts can come in the exam as well. So you must learn RAID, and you must also learn the concept called as a bit splitting and bit splitting and erasure coding actually, because
yeah,
both of these things can be testable in the exam.
I agree. Erasure coding and bit splitting is also another important topic that we should not ignore, because it gives you the idea about how to maintain the quality of a data and the effectiveness of the data.
Yes.
So that's another important pointer we have that we need to understand.
Yes.
Along with that, when you're talking about data flow, so what we are learning from this data flow process here?
So data flow in the sense means that now there is a data you're storing in the cloud platform. You want to make sure that how the data is being accessed and where the data is being stored. So
Hmm,
like the same way it is there, we have to
hmm,
make sure that how the data is getting replicated from one location to another, or
hmm,
is it basically crossing any kind of legal boundaries, or
hmm.
is it maintaining the proper data residency requirements, the controls, and all this stuff is basically what we call as the data flow actually. So we are talking about, like, for example, let's suppose that when I'm putting a data in the cloud service platform, so what is happening to this data? So where is it getting replicated? And is it within a proper legal boundary? How do I ensure that? And that is basically a concern which we have to mandatorily address when you go to cloud computing. Because
Great.
normally we say that when you go to cloud computing, in some ways we are actually increasing our risk. And one major risk which we have is that the location and access to our data, because
Yeah,
at the end of the day, there's a third party there for sure.
I agree.
Yep.
Agree.
Yep.
And when it comes to the requirement of data flow, we also need to ensure that okay, data should be flowed in such a manner that it should meet the compliance, legal, regulatory requirements, and all that. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes,
That is
exactly.
also matter. Great.
For sure. Yes.
So coming to the next part, we have a next module which is called as a design implement cloud storage architecture.
Yes.
So in this, we're talking about storage type. So how important you think the storage type in from the exam perspective or from a preparation perspective?
So previously in the previous curriculums, what I have seen is that when we talk about the word called as storage types, they are just referring to some few kind of storages in the cloud platform.
Hmm,
For example, if you go for the previous curriculum, I have seen that if you go to IaaS, they have only two types of storage. We have something
hmm,
called as a volume storage and object storage, and if you go
hmm,
for a PaaS, we have only structured unstructured. But
hmm.
now I guess that the ISA square has basically increased the number of they have subdivided into again multiple categories. Like they have made it like a volume storage, object storage, raw storage. Then they have
Long-term
something
storage.
long-term storage, ephemeral
Hmm,
storage, like that. So
hmm.
that is basically very important, and it will be testable in the exam, because whenever you are a CCSP, even though
Hmm.
you are not the person who is deploying the storage types, but you must clearly understand what is the benefit and drawback of each storage type and what is the use cases. Like
Exactly.
for example, let's say if I'm going to a scenario where I'm using a platform, so what is the backend storage I can use for my website, or what is this storage type I can use for my operating system? So the use cases is the most important thing. You must clearly learn the use cases of each kind of storage and the
Exactly.
difference between them. Yeah. And
So
sorry.
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I have seen there is one more type called as a raw storage, where this is actually they have newly introduced. It's just a simple thing actually, even though it's a very simple thing, but still it can confuse the people when you go to the examination as well, because this kind of storage types are really testable in a with a very much details also, because nowadays the people are basically when you go to a cloud storage, there's a lot of risk involved, and the access and types is basically a concern for us. So that's a reason why this will be testable in the exam for sure.
And one thing is that, what my suggestion for all the aspirants is that when it comes to especially volume storage and object storage, you need to know the use case of that. Example, object storage is basically used for read only, where you can create a file, you upload, and as a URL you can access from anywhere. But in the case of volume storage, we can use for the read and write purpose. So this is how the use case you need to know. One thing I missed in a data dispersion, please note down. This is the exam pointer. From a data dispersion point of view, the biggest concern is basically latency, because you're retrieving the content from multiple locations. So latency is basically the biggest concern. Now coming back to the storage type, as I said, we have a three type of storage here. We already covered one part, which is basically IaaS. We have a multiple type of storage. The second part is basically called as a PaaS,
Yes.
platform as a services. So in platform as services, we also talk about database structure and structure. We talk about the disk. So do you wish to share any pointers here, Krish?
So in the storage types, when we talk about the storage types, so basically, as I said before, these are different kind of storage types we are having, and we have
Hmm,
to learn the use case also. Also,
hmm,
as a part of it, when you're discussing about these kind of storage, like especially in past platform, we have something called as a structured storage, unstructured storage. Then we have now something which is they are renaming it as a database kind of storage, disk
hmm,
storage. So we one baseline point we have to keep in mind is that when you go to a cloud infrastructure, there is a cloud physical infrastructure. On top of that, we have a IaaS storage, and
hmm,
on top of that we have a PaaS storage. So each
hmm,
of these things are built on top of the other. Like the IaaS is built on top of the PaaS is built on top of the SaaS. Sorry, the PaaS is built on top of the IaaS, and SaaS is built on top of the PaaS. So that's something which we have to keep in mind. That means the same volume storage which we have in the IaaS platform is which is basically what we call as a database storage, mostly in the PaaS service. So that's something which we have to always know. So this is actually connected each other. It's not something which is different. It's always connected each other. That's the one
ex-
point. Yeah.
and
And
but yeah,
just
go
one
ahead.
just one more point I want to add with this is because that is I can say that is one of the most important topics you have to learn in CCSP, because when you go for a object storage, the object storage can be accessed via a web URL. Like we can access via
Yeah,
URL, and more than that URL access, we access them via APIs. So
APIs. Yeah,
insecure APIs is the most important concern when talking about the object storage. So whenever
agreed.
you think about the word called as object storage, always keep in mind that API is a concern, because if you're using third party APIs, that's gonna make us in trouble, because if we are
Exactly.
not testing it. Yeah.
And don't get confused in the from the preparation point of view. Your that is called your blob, which is called as a binary large object, is called as an unstructured,
Exactly.
which is basically that does not adhere to any particular data model, and it is basically used in a reference like AWS S3, or you can say Azure Bob in the
Azure Blob
Azure.
containers.
Yeah.
Yes.
Another important thing, we have a SaaS. So in a
Yes.
SaaS, we also have a different type of storage. Especially we talk about CDN, right, Krish? CDN we
CDN.
have.
Then
The
we have an
biggest
application.
advantage of CDN is basically improve the accessibility, reduce the latency.
Exactly.
But because of decentralized concern, confidentiality is a concern, legal regulated need to be reviewed
Location.
before using a
Location.
CDN.
Yeah.
So
Location is
that
the
is the thing.
biggest concern. Yeah.
Exactly. Along with that, I think content file storage is there. Then we have information storage and management. These
Yes.
are some of the topics, which is basically type of storage we covered in the SaaS. Again, in a SaaS, when you're talking about the storage, it is accessed by the APIs. Insecure APIs is a concern. Make sure validate the API, test the API before integrating the API for any kind of a SaaS solutions.
Yes.
So, do you wish to share any pointers here, Krish?
So basically, in the SaaS, the one biggest concern is that the control which we have is basically the
Hmm,
least one. So basically, we have to make sure that, and as we all know that when you talk about data privacy and security is always the concern and basically the liability of the cloud service consumer. So
hmm.
basically, what happens is that when you go for an application level storage in the SaaS, you have to be very clear, very careful about the kind of vendors you're using, because if they are not following any kind of proper security mechanisms, at the end of the day, the legal liability will come to you only. So you have to make sure that you validate the vendor properly before onboarding that SaaS services from the vendor. Otherwise, what happens when you are just storing the data through their console, so or maybe their application interface. So if there is something happens in the backend, at the end of the day, still you will be affected.
Exactly. So
Yes.
there's another important pointer which we need to understand, because it is very important from a storage perspective how you validate, how you define the functions and everything. So that is another important pointer we have.
Yes.
Now coming back to the pointer called the functionality of the threats to
Mm-hmm.
the storage types. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're talking about threat to storage type, so threat to storage type, we have a different type of threats, like we have unauthorized access, unauthorized provisioning. We talk about the regulatory compliance. Okay, these are the major threats what we have discovered in jurisdiction issues. Then denial of services and malwares, thefts and media loss. So how important you think, Krish, the person need to prepare for the certification
So
from our tips here?
definitely, when you learn about the threat to storage types, you must understand the use cases. And the first
Mm,
point, which is always there in the textbooks, also is basically that whenever you talk about the threats in the storage types, you have to understand what kind of threat you're facing and make sure that you implement the proper controls in order to specifically address those threats. That's a point which we have to keep in mind. The second point is that when talking about threats to storage types, in fact, when you go to a cloud computing, if you see the latest one called as the CSA Pandemic 11 or Notorious 9, etc., there's a lot of specific threats which they have
mm,
mentioned. That means they are still valid and they are now one of the major concerns in the industry. So you must clearly understand the concept of unauthorized access, unauthorized usage. Then we have to also understand the malware introduction, lack of proper sanitization. So all these kind of threats we have to understand, or what is it actually. It's very important to understand, even though we don't have to learn it how it's done in a technical way sometimes, but still you have to learn about what exactly is the kind of threat and what is the basic control we have for that. For example, we have something called as a unauthorized usage and access. So what exactly is unauthorized usage and access? Then what are the
mm.
key security controls we can have further? Like we have a identity and access management, we have a continuous monitoring, like that. We have different controls are there to address that. So that also must be properly understood.
Excellent. So let's move to the next part now. So we have a next section, very interesting, very informative section we have, which is called as a design and apply technologies and strategy. So Krish, how do you think this section is basically critical?
I don't know why, but this session is actually loved by IC Square for a long time, I guess, because I can see this. They are highlighting this a long time because this is one of the major topics which is testable in the CCSP examination. I feel, because the topic called as encryption and key management is the most important thing for sure. The
Mm,
reason is because when talking about cloud computing, as I said yesterday, we have a data and data needs protection based on the type
mm,
of sensitivity, and based on that sensitivity level, we have to make sure we have a proper controls. And in the cloud platform, encryption is a major control we are having. That is something which we have to very clearly understand. And you must understand the different type of encryption. Like when you say you're understanding the different type of encryption, there are two things you have to always memorize. One is basically the location of the encryption algorithm and the location
mm,
of the key file. It's very important to learn. So for example, let's say if I'm going for something called as an instance manager encryption, you have to make sure, okay, now the key file is basically inside my instance, the
mm.
encryption engine is also inside my instance. So like that, you must understand for each kind of encryption mechanisms, where is the key file located, where is the encryption algorithm located. That is most important.
Yeah, so I could agree with that, Krish, also in this part. Encryption section is basically very important when it comes to the integration part
Yes.
and how to use the key, how to create a key, what is the best practice, how to destroy the key, especially we talk about the FIPS and all that. And in the encryption section, there is a one key pointer which I want to recommend, and they have improved that in a new version of CBK, which talk about the different type of encryption, like storage level encryption, volume based encryption, their advantage, disadvantage. Then we have object level encryption, their advantage, disadvantage, use case of file level encryption, application level encryption, data level encryption. So uh, if you want to know more about the encryption on storage, there is a one dedicated video I made on YouTube, so you can check that. But you really need to know about the pros and cons when you're going to implement the encryptions on the storage level, because encryption on one side offer the great security, but
Hmm.
encryption on the other side is basically offer a lot of latencies, a lot of processing and all that. Understand in this way, suppose when we're trying to upload any data, processing any data, so first it need to decrypt, then we process, we need to encrypt, then it process. So too much security, too much encryption sometimes impact the functionality. So
Yes.
when we're talking about the use cases of the storage level encryptions and all that, we need to understand the difference between the functionality and security. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Exactly, 100%. Yeah. Especially,
Especially,
this topic called as homomorphic encryption also very important nowadays, actually, because now that is getting applied in multiple cloud platforms, because Azure is now one of the biggest, motivators of this thing called as a homomorphic encryption. So that can also be testable in the exam, I feel, because the reason is because homomorphic encryption is now it was a concept previously, but now it is actually being used in the industry for last 2 3 years. So definitely that's very important to add with when you're learning.
And one more important thing we need to understand is data obfuscation that is primarily used in a data and use stage, because you need to understand when data is encrypted you can't process the data, but still we have a technology which is called homomorphic encryption. But along with that, if you really want to process the data in a use stage and you want to balance the security, then in that case we use a data obfuscation. So in
Yeah.
this we talk about the substitution, we talk about the shuffling, we talk about the deletion nullification of the data. So obfuscation often implement when sensitive data need to be used in a different situation from from the primary use cases. For example, we can remove or replace the sensitive data items before we sending a data to the parties. And when it comes to masking, masking is two type. We have static and dynamic. Static is basically talk about your the data which is used in a production. If you want to use a production data, we can mask the data by removing the identities and all that. And dynamic masking we use like a login pages where you enter the password in a on-prem. But anonymization and pseudonymization is basically the origin come from the GDPR perspective when we need to process the PI, and we need to make sure we should process the PI in such a manner that it should not reveal the information, right, Krish?
Exactly, exactly. Masking is one of the most important topics because when talking about the word called as obfuscation of data, it's actually about the process of either hiding or replacing or substituting sensitive data. And we have different types like masking and all these kind of concepts come as a part of the obfuscation. And in masking, especially this static masking is also very important because this is the simple example for this kind of things. Let's suppose that now I am showing a use case. Like for example, if I'm when I'm teaching a session, I'm just trying to show them a cloud report which I have made for our organization, or when I'm basically trying to showcase a audit report which I have done for our organization. I have to make sure I remove every possible direct or indirect identifiers which can refer to the business. So otherwise, what
Exactly.
happens that can reveal the sensitivity of the organization, right? So that's why static masking is very important for us. That is guaranteed, very important for sure, because when you go for any CCSP exam or any kind of critical exams like this, masking is a the static masking is a very important concept which we have to understand. And dynamic masking is pretty much simple, as Prab said. Now, like when you basically let's suppose that I'm calling a bank, and you will get a message that, or you will get that person in the bank will ask you for the last four digits of the credit card number. So that reason is because the rest is basically mask for him. Like the same way, we have to clearly understand the difference between static and dynamic masking for sure.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And one more important thing which I understood is that in GDPR point of view, from a data protection, we're using a pseudonymization. So if
Yes.
you're talking about from preparation point of view, remember one point that in GDPR we use a pseudonymization, which is basically trying to protect the data in the GDPR perspective. So that's something you need to know. And another important thing, what we talk about the tokenization, where we're replacing a data with the alternate value before we sending a data over the network, which is one
Yep.
of most secure method we have.
Yep.
Now coming back to the DLP. So, Krish, how you rate DLP in CCSP? Like, is
So
it
it is actually, like I said, in encryption, the DLP and that DRM is one of the most important topics you have to learn. But
mm,
again, I'm when talking about the like in any till now for the whole CCSP, like in the previous exam curriculum or new exam curriculum, also this topic remains the same because when we go to the cloud platform, one of the major things which can basically make us in trouble is the DLP. For example, let's suppose that I'm having a DLP in my business in my on premises. When you go to the cloud platform, definitely there also you must be having a DLP implementation there. But again, what are the specific challenges for DLP in the cloud platform? That is something which is very important for us to understand for sure. Plus the types of DLP, like how can we basically protect our data at rest, data in motion or data in transit, and data in use. So for all these things, what are the different kind of DLP we can use, and what are the functionalities of DLP, like how DLP will basically do the proper data discovery and classification, then how they will basically help us to protect the data. All these things are most important for us to learn. And just one more thing which I have felt while teaching the CCSP club, like in the previous topic called as tokenization, understand the working of tokenization. It's very important, and you have to always remember the standard called as PCI DSS as a part of learning tokenization. It's very
agree?
important. Yep, that's it.
And when it comes to DLP part, you need to know the components of DLP. See, one thing you need to understand: DLP is basically a solution which monitor the data which is leaving the cloud environment. We
Yes.
have a solution like firewalls and all that which monitor data which is coming from outside. But DLP is basically the solution which primarily use to ensure the data should not live in an unauthorized manner.
Yes.
So when we're talking about DLP, in DLP we talk about the components like discovery of the data, monitoring of the data, enforcement of the data. Along with that, we also talk about the use cases. The primary challenge of DLP is in a SaaS, because in SaaS you cannot implement the DLP like a integration, but it is easy to manage the DLP in the PaaS and IaaS environment. DLP, what is the limitations like operational issues, processing issues, and all that. So you should know all this perspective. One thing is that to protecting intellectual property in the cloud and make sure you to control the data movement in the cloud, we use DLP because of the cloud dynamic in nature.
Yeah.
Now coming back to the next part, when you're talking about in DLP, one challenge is basically fail to inspect the encrypted data, right, Krish?
Yes, exactly. And one more thing I want to add is that when you go for a DLP, we have to always make sure that when any kind of DLP solution which we are using in the cloud platform, it must be designed with specifically cloud in mind. Because when you try to implement the same DLP solution which was having in the on-premises, it may not basically give you that much fruits you're expecting. The reason is because the cloud is having a bit more wider thrust that perspective. So the reason is because make sure when you go for a DLP in the cloud platform, it must be designed for cloud in mind, and it must be able to address the specific cloud concerns as well. That's also very important, which we have to understand, I feel.
Thanks, Krish. And now the next topic, which is part of a new syllabus of CCSP, which is introduced last year, is key certificates and secrets.
Exactly.
So, what is your view on this?
So that's actually even though they have specifically mentioned this as a new topic in the curriculum, which I have seen that
Mm.
this is basically there here and there in all the curriculums which were like in the previous curriculums which we have, even though it's not mentioned as a part of a domain, but still it was there in every domain in some words. For example, team, I'll give you a simple example for why it's important for us to have a proper secrets management. For example, let's suppose I am developing an application now, and in my application, if I hard code the credentials of a database, it can sometimes lead to a massive challenges. It can fail the compliance, a lot of things like that. But at the same time, if you know how to store and manage and properly rotate your secrets, then what happens is that it can basically introduce the or it can basically help us to have a more security architecture there. In fact, in any architecture which I am designing now also, this the secrets management is a very important concern which we have, because we have an application, so we want to make sure that we don't store any kind of credentials as a part of the application itself. We store them separately with a separate encryption key and mechanism, so making sure it's properly secured and properly rotated. So secrets management is very important, plus also the key management, which are all, like we said before, that also is coming as a part of the curriculum for a long time. So it definitely is very important for sure.
Thank you, Krish. And when you're talking about the secrets, keys, and certificates, see, when you're talking about the key part, so key is often used for the encryption, okay, operations. So by which we identify the user. When you're talking about the secrets, these are the secondary authentication mechanism that is basically used to verify the communication which has not been hijacked. So normally the APIs and all that, we do the peer secure authentications and then we exchange the data.
Yes.
So it is also used to verify, I think, integrity of the communication. Okay, and the last is called a certificate, which is used for verifying the third party. Now,
Yes.
secret, when you're talking about now practice of secret management, when we say practice of key secret certificate management, is basically handled depending upon the sensitivity of a data.
Exactly.
Okay, and many organizations face challenge with the secret sprawl, similar to the predetermined user phase with a unique password required across a multitude system. So secrets are typically associated with the non-human accounts, which basically need access by the API's keys, or you can say device-based certificate, which is designed to authenticate remote system making requests. So whenever there is an excessive use of APIs are introduced, and between the two applications need to be interact, but before that they need to authenticate. They're primarily using a secret which is embedded in the systems and data encryption with the keys and all that. That is
Exactly.
why I personally believe, okay, in the cloud environment, this is very important. But one thing is that regardless of the type of secret being used, all secret management tools should be configured to log access request and use of a secret, and make sure log should be enabled by which we can able to track what went wrong and all that. Along with that, whatever the key management we are using, it should be properly secure and it should be isolate from the key itself because it should have a single point of access, right?
Yes. Yeah, Prabha, actually, that what that specific point you said is very important when you're working. See, if you're a person who is working in cloud computing, this point, what Prabh said, that logging must be the most important thing. Logging is the most important thing which we have to keep in mind, because when talking about key management, secrets management, or all this kind of stuff, logs must be there, because that is one major baseline which is recommended by CIS and many other organizations, specifically when they're talking about this key and secrets management. Logging is very important for sure.
I agree. I
Yeah.
agree.
Yeah.
So moving to the next part, which is basically called as a
Data,
implement
data discovery.
data
This
data discovery and classification.
exactly.
I think very very important.
For sure.
Yeah, because when you're talking about implement your data discovery, classification, structure and structured data is very important because in data in the cloud is basically dynamic in nature and we're generating a lot of data. right? So when we're dealing with the different type of data, okay, so
Mhm.
we have a structured data, unstructured data, and semi-structured data. So how you manage this data in the cloud from a security point of view, it should not compromise the confidentiality. So all these pointers are basically very important. So Krish, do you wish to share your pointers on this area?
For sure. When you basically go for something called as a structured, unstructured, and semi-structured, we have to first of all understand the difference. Like for
Mm,
example, now if you go for a text, you're writing in Notepad and you're writing having a text there, and that is
mm,
basically most of our unstructured data we are having. And
mm.
structured is basically where we are talking about the rows and column kind of, the data which is stored in a row and column structure, like a relational databases we are having.
In more layman term, we can say structured data is like RDBMS, unstructured is a big data.
Exactly. And we
Yeah.
have something called a semi-structured data where we are writing data in a HTML format or
Mm.
maybe XML format. That's basically what we call semi-structured data. And this is very important for you to understand. The second most important point is that which of this is basically more easy for discovery and classification. So structured data is basically having more ease when you're talking about discovery and classification because it's organized and it's already indexed. That's very important to learn.
And if you want to discover the data in unstructured data, so you have to label the data. By
Label
labeling
it.
the data, you can able to discover the data in unstructured. But as a CCSP, you must know it is easy to find the data in a structure, but it is difficult to find the data in structure. And a countermeasure is basically by using a data labeling approach. You can dealing with the unstructured data. Label can basically use to classify and identify the data, by which we can able to locate the data in a more easy manner.
Exactly. And to add with the data labeling itself is also called as data tagging as well, because in some textbooks I have seen that some people referring to as a data tagging also. So labels are also called as tags. So team, when you talk about the word called as discovery and classification, the three things, that is, one is metadata, that is very important for sure. Then we have a labels or tags. Then we have the content analysis. These are the three mechanisms which we have to keep in mind. It's very important for us to learn these things. Thank you.
Exactly. And we also have a further analysis of the data which is called pattern matching, lexical analysis, and the hashing. So
Yes.
when you're talking about pattern matching, we basically try to check the known format. Like, we try to pick the data and see the credit card numbers and all that. So by which we try to locate is the sensitive data is leaving the organization. Then we talk about your lexical analysis, where we try to understand the context of the data. Okay, so example like we will enable the red flag if any point of time in any data is basically mentioned called payment details, sensitive information. And the third is basically called as a hashing. So that is basically the techniques we can use. And along with that, we have a new concept in the new syllabus CCSP, which is called as semi-structured data.
Yes.
So data that has some structure, but it's not strictly structure, is known as a semi-structured data. So example, object-oriented database. That is a perfect example of the semi-structured data, right?
Yes.
Where the files or others unstructured, you can say data can be stored in objects. So we
Yes.
are using some kind of a tags here like HTML, XML, JSON, by which we can able to locate. So
Exactly.
one particular challenge for data discovery is the inclusion of the unstructured data
Mhm.
into structured data sets. So
And
that's
quality
why
of data. And
quality of
quality.
data, which is
Exactly.
called due to the integrity issue. So these are some of the concerns you have that you need to identify.
Exactly.
And I believe, Krish, there's a new pointer which is added in the new syllabus, which is called as a data location.
Yep. Even though it's a new point which they have added, like I said before, this is something which is a concern when you work in the cloud from the day one. Like
Mm.
when talking about cloud security or data security in cloud computing, the location and access to data is a most important concern for us, because at the end of the day, even if it's a cloud service provider make a mistake, you are the one who is liable for all this kind of stuff. So we have to make sure that the location of data is properly identified, and in each location which we have for data, what level of access we are allowing also is very important. So that is one major topic which is basically there. You're when you're working in cloud computing, it's not about the exam only. When you're working in cloud computing, when talking about data, one primary concern you have is the controls we have. Then we have a location of data. Location is a very important thing.
That's why one thing is that we're using a DLP to monitor the data. And whenever we go for any kind of a discovery tool for discovering the data in the cloud, we have to identify what is the service you're using and what is the location you have. So according to that only, you can decide which kind of a data discovery tool you have to use to discover this data. So that point you need to remember.
Exactly.
Now, the next part we have called data labeling. We have already discussed. So the next module we have called design and implement the IRM.
Yes.
Yes, boss. What is your view on the
So
IRM?
this is highly testable in the exam. When you talk about the IRM, there are there are two things we have to keep in mind. One is about the defense in depth approach. Let's suppose that we have a DLP. So DLP and all the other kind of stuff we are having is able to protect your data until the data is basically within your premises. But when
Mm.
the data left your premises, the only control we are having properly is basically the IRM, or we can say DRM. And you have to understand the difference between what is a DRM and what is a IRM. That is also very important. When you talk about the normal DRM, it's for the consumer media, and IRM is talking about the enterprise DRM kind of concept, where we're talking about the emails or those kind of enterprise media. It's very important for sure. Then in which all service models which we can use it, or basically what are the what are the constraints we have, like DLP. When using IRM also, it's not possible in the SaaS from a customer perspective. If you go for IaaS, it's more easier. So that is something which we have to understand very well. And also has to make sure that DLP and IRM is not a substitute for one another. It must work. It must be working together. That means that when DLP fails, IRM will come in picture. So basically, both must be working together in a proper defense in depth approach. That is very important for us to learn that actually.
That's a very good point that you have referred. And when it comes to the IRM part, I think we have some pointers like consumer graded IRM. Okay, we have an enterprise grade RM. So these are another pointers we have. And today we are using this IRM and DRM to protecting a digital data. Now, one thing you need to understand from a DRM point of view, because of the data dynamic in nature, it basically goes to the multiple locations. So it is
Mhm.
also act like a compensatory control for DLP. Now,
Yes.
by hook and crook, suppose this is my cloud.
Mhm.
Okay, so we have a data here. So by hook and crook, hacker was able to download the data. So in that case, DLP is already failed because the DLP is failed to protect this data. But still, if data goes downloaded in the hacker system, still because of DRM protected data, if you try to open, it will ask for the password and all that. Example. So that is how the DRM can able to protect the data and use and protect the data even in the transit or when leaving the organization control.
Yes.
So whenever you basically going for the IRM, we can use the integration with our applications and we can review the company policies and according to that, we can take a call.
Yes, exactly.
And next part when you're talking about, which is called as a plan, implement, data retention, deletion, archiving, how you think it's basically important for the preparation?
So actually, there is a lot of points we have to learn in this particular topic, especially when
Mm,
talking about the data retention policy. We have see it's not only about how long we have to keep the data. The biggest mistake that people think is that, "Oh, so Krish, it's talking about data retention policy, so we will keep it for next 10 years or 5 years or 2 years." Is that talking about the policy? It's
mm,
not like that. When talking about retention policy, we have to think about how long we have to keep it, in what security mechanisms we have to provide for that, in what within what time we must be able to retrieve that, what are the how do we basically monitor it. So all these things are basically very important part of a data retention policy for sure.
mm,
Then we have something called as a deletion, where in the cloud platform we have something called as a crypto shredding. We have to make sure that we keep our data for a particular amount of time, and after that we want to make sure we delete it. So like for example, now if I say that, let's suppose that as per a HIPAA compliance or as per a particular compliance, we have to keep our data for 5 years. So that means that once the data reaches 5 years, we have to make sure we delete the data. So the reason why we can't keep it more than that is because it will cause a cost liability to the business. So we want to make
exactly.
sure that we keep our data only till that particular minimum period guaranteed by, or which is basically mandatory for the business. That's very important. Then finally, there is something called as archiving. We have to understand archiving means that, so in the examination also you have to keep this point in mind. Archiving is the primary reason why we do archive is the cost, because when you go for any compliance requirements, they only say that you have to keep it for this much amount of time, but they never say you have to archive the data. And archiving is the major reason why we are doing the archiving is the cost part, because you can save up to 80 to 90% cost when you basically store your data in an archival storage, if you want to have it a long term storage. Actually, that's what we call as a archiving.
And I agree. One more point here is basically when you're talking about data retention, it is always driven by two primary objective. One is basically called as the operational need, like data must be available to support the organization operation.
Mhm.
And second most important thing is basically called as a compliance requirement, because sometimes it's a compliance requirement to retain the data. But if we're talking about retaining a data, okay, if I retain the data till the data is with me, it is my liability.
Yes.
But if I don't define any kind of a timeline and all that, and data will keep with me for 50 years. So it is a 50 years liability for me. So that's why in order to protect against the liabilities and all that, we create a retention policy. But when you're dealing with the retention policy, two important factor another is required. One is called as a integrity and one is called as availability. Because when we're taking a backups, example like here, we're talking about the suppose we have a site one and we have a site two. So data is not in use, so we basically archive the data and move the data to the offsite. So this is basically my offsite. So tomorrow, from the backup point of view, also we need to retrieve the data. So make sure when I retrieve the data, it should be stayed in a particular format. Okay. So when I retrieve the data, it should be retrieved in the same state, and make sure it should be defined in a proper functional manner. So retention with the availability, it must be available whenever it required, and integrity is another
Yes,
important pointer we have. So that we
exactly.
need to check. Okay.
Yeah, availability, integrity, then the retention period is very important. Then basically, like we have to make sure that we tested properly. Also, that's why we can ensure the integrity of the data. Also, yeah.
And along with that, if you get a question from the perspective that pointer that okay, why data retention is basically, or what is the most important thing required for data retention? So answer is basically first is legal regulatory requirement, because
Yes,
we creating a data retention for legal requirement perspective. Is it clear?
yes.
That's the most important thing. Okay. Next thing is basically called as a uh,
Legal hold.
legal hold. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what is your perspective on legal hold?
So legal hold is also it's actually there for a long time in the curriculum, but again, it's very important. So legal hold is basically where you have to keep your data when there is a legal case or basically some kind of subpoena occurs. We want to make sure that we keep our data properly and basically, let's suppose that when the court, the cloud service provider has to surrender some particular person's data to the court of law, uh, we have to make sure our data is basically properly protected and we don't delete the data. Like for example, now we have a data which is supposed to be deleted on the next 5 years. So basically, when there is a legal hold happens, the data is not supposed to be deleted until the hold is over. That's also very important to understand.
That's great.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about from a security point of view, uh, uh, one thing I want to understand from the perspective is about legal hold is basically come under the documents and all that under the contracts. So that's something we required also, right?
Yes,
Because legal
exactly.
hold is simple is all about the important implication for the data retention.
Exactly.
So when data is placed under the legal hold, the retention schedule is indefinitely suspended. And if it's normally retained for 7 year or placed under legal hold, it must be written under the legal hold is lifted, even if the 7 year retention period. So it's again depending upon how you retain the data. But one
Exactly.
thing is that the primary challenge surrounding the legal hold, you can say like including the applicable records to be
Yes.
held and implement a way to exclude the record from standard deletion procedures. And the second challenge of excluding the records under legal hold from the deletion is the data management problem. So that is another important thing we have.
Exactly.
So records placed under the legal hold are often included in the process of discovery, which is done as a part of an investigation and you're gathering evidence of a suspected wrongdoing for the compliance reason. So with the help of DLP also, we can able to discover those pointers.
Exactly.
So moving to the next part, which is called as a design and implement auditability, traceability, accountability for data events. So what is
Yes.
your thought in that?
So basically, in this, there are only a specific points which I feel which is very important. Specifically, like when talking about event sources and all these things, you have to make sure that what is the level of access which you have for each kind of cloud or like for logs or those kind of any kind of event activities happened when you go for IaaS or PaaS or SaaS platforms you have having, and basically what is the what how that log files must look like, or how that log files can be interpreted, how we are storing it, the SIM solution, and basically how we can basically analyze the log files properly, and how we can use it for our security purposes. All these things are very important for this for sure, because at the end of the day, logging is basically a very important factor for accountability, and basically that is something which is very clear to understand for sure.
And when you're talking about the traceability and auditability, what is the other factor we can consider, Krish, from auditability point of view?
So when talking about auditability, when you see when talking about log files, the key thing is that we have to make sure that we must be able to recreate that event, what happened. Like we must be having a proper narration of event that we have basically had happened at that time. Because if you don't have a proper logging strategy, like where you're storing the log files, how you are consolidating it, how we are storing it, what kind of security mechanism you are having to protect the integrity of log files, security of log files, and all these things are very important for us to understand for sure. Yes, and how we are basically normalizing it for SIM solutions, how the SIM tool is able to access it and basically process it. All these things are very important. What level of access we have for each kind of log files, because if you go for a PaaS platform, you don't have a proper access to the OS log files. You only have an access to the application log files. Like the same way for each level, we have a limitation there. So that also is something which we have to understand on this.
And when it comes to the requirement of validations and all that, chain of custody and round repetition is very important,
For
but
sure.
it is difficult to maintain in the cloud.
Yes,
It is
exactly.
difficult to maintain in the cloud. Okay.
Yep.
So overall, when you're talking about the requirement in the chain of custody, like chain of custody is all about the sequence in which we have obtained the evidence and by the people. So example, if I obtain the evidence, I hand over the evidence to Krish hand over the evidence to other parties. So that information is basically maintained in the chain of custody. And we submit the chain of custody in the court, okay, along with the evidence. And non-repudiation basically means sender cannot deny for his action. So we basically achieve that through the help of signatures and everything, right, Krish? But
Exactly.
maintaining this in a cloud is always a concern. The reason is very simple: is you don't have a complete control over the cloud infrastructure. At least in the on-prem, you have control of the machines and you can able to do that. But when it comes to the requirement of logging, storage, analysis of a data event, most important thing you need to understand from the preparation point of view is synchronization time across all the server and devices.
For sure. For sure. Yes.
So if you don't synchronize the time, if you don't have a common timestamp across all the devices, it is difficult for you to recreate the events. So synchronize the time across all the device is very important, because timestamp of the event is important to create a chain of custody. Time of evidence is timestamp is basically important because by this we can able to recreate the same. So it is basically very important how you synchronize the time,
Yes.
okay, and how you collecting a logs, and you need to collect the enough log by which you can able to create a meaningful information. So we consider multiple things, like we talk about the classification scheme, we talk about the attributes by which we collecting a data. You look for the user identity, you look for the IP address, geolocation. Now when it comes to geolocation, similar to the IP address, geolocation information is important data element in capturing the logs, because organization user based in the same country are likely to access the organization resource from within the country. So activity that originates from a foreign location is anomaly. So that is why nowadays in the logs we need to capture the geolocation details, which is
Exactly.
basically, and geolocation is also frequently used in a protective safeguard as a dynamic access controls. Okay, it
Yes.
because sometimes what happen, live example, when you try to access any your Gmail from unknown IPs, locations, and all that, ask for the OTP. Same like OTT platform, you cannot access from the other countries if it's basically banned in that country.
Yes.
So that is why these factors are basically very important. So when you're collecting a logs, maintain the integrity, okay,
Mhm.
maintain the normalizations, okay, automations, continuous monitoring is another important factor we have. So chain of custody is important because that is how you can able to take the call.
Yes.
So as I said, this domain is basically very important. Areas which very important in this domain from the preparation point of view is encryption types, type of storage encryption, type of storage, their use cases, DLP, CSU, SAD, and the timestamp. Okay. And Krish, do you wish to share any last point before we wrap up the session?
So basically, in this domain, like as Prab said, like that's all I want to also discuss. Like, make sure that we whatever we have discussed in the session, that key points you must always keep in mind, because you can get a lot of questions maybe in this exam because of this, because this part of data is one of the most important thing which is concerned when you do talk to a cloud platform. So definitely this domain is going to be a most important thing for sure.
And if you're looking for the channel, if you're looking for the function, if you're looking for the parameters, just give me a second, Krish. So we're talking about the sections of content and all that. So team, if you're looking for more content like that and you want me to disturb Krish again for the next session, which is called domain 3, do let me know in the comment box. So I'm going to disturb my brother. I will take him out from this busy schedule and bring more content like that. And if you're new to the channel, do subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to make sure you should not miss our future videos on a similar topic. We bringing more talks, bio talks, and brother talks on the cloud security. So you can see a lot of series this year on this particular topic.
For sure.
Krish, do you have any last pointer to
Nothing to.
discuss?
That's all. That's all. Like, this was a very interesting session. Actually, like it's super interesting to discuss things like this for sure. See you, team. We'll meet in the next session for sure.
Sure.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye
team.
bye.
Take care.